Good evening, gentlemen. It's been a minute, as someone said. Our class is still holding in the middle of chapter 4 of Tanya. Really, we just got started. We're still right near the beginning here. Chapter 4 of Tanya, of Likutei Amarim Tanya, the first part of Tanya, is about what does the godly soul do? That's really what it's the answer to. Chapter 1 is about the animals, the essence of the animal soul. Chapter 2 is about the essence of the godly soul, which is that it's a piece of God above, literally. Chapter 3 is about, but how does that piece of God above exist in a finite way, in a limited and defined way within the world? Chapter 4 is about what does that godly soul do? In other words, is there some form of expression of the godly soul? Is there any way that it is manifest? Generally speaking, the terms expression or manifestation imply that you are departing from the thing as it is, right? To have some kind of impact or some out of effect externally, or at least if externally is too blunt a word, to have an effect in some other medium, in some other way. And the answer is yes, the godly soul does have means of expression. Those means of expression are called machshava, dibur, umaisa, which means thought, speech, and action. These are the interfaces, also called the garments. The Tanya term is garment, levushim, the garments of the godly soul. And the godly soul's garments, as the Alter Rebbe immediately clarifies, are not thought, speech, and action about just anything, because that is an animal soul issue, being about just anything. Rather, it is thought, speech, and action about God, which means more precisely the thought, speech, and action of Torah and mitzvahs, because, as we were just starting to get to the last time we learned, the only thought, speech, and action that is actually about God, and that can actually be about God, is in a real profound way, in a certain sense, is Torah and mitzvahs. And so, thought, speech, and action that are truly God-directed are the thought, speech, and action of Torah. There's the thought of the understanding of Torah, there's the speaking of the words of Torah, there's the action and the performing of the action mitzvahs, as the Alter Rebbe categorizes them. And these are the expressions of the godly soul. And in fact, we made a radical redefinition and said that mitzvahs themselves, the commandments of the Torah, are really just expressions of the godly soul. And expressions of what? Expressions of its love. That the love of the godly soul is manifested and expressed in the 248 positive commandments of the Torah. This answers the fundamental, the core, the implicit question of chapter 4 of Tanya, as we've been describing it in multiple classes. The implicit question of chapter 4 of Tanya is, why would a godly soul need to do anything at all? Right? A godly soul is a piece of God above, literally. It is always close to God. In fact, it cannot get any closer. It is literally a piece of God. For what that means, you have to go back to chapter 2 and re-study those lessons in that chapter. And so why would the soul need to go out from itself into the external, into the objective reality, into the realm where it can merely be expressed, right, and have some form of self-expression? Why would the godly soul get out of bed in the morning? The godly soul in bed in the morning is 100% united with God in a way that getting out of bed could not improve, because it's its core identity, it's its core essence, right? What it is God. It's a piece of God, right? What it is God, of course, with an asterisk. What it means to be a piece of, right? And the various classes we had about that, but you get the point I'm trying to make. And we answered this question before we took our minute-long break in this class. We answered this question. We began to answer this question anyway. The beginning of the answer to this question is that if the soul wants to cleave to God, if the soul wants dvekus, which means cleaving, clinging, profound attachment to God, which is what its love is seeking, is the object of its love of the divine. In other words, the soul's love of God's culmination or consummation, even if you will, is in cleaving to God. That's what it means. That's what it means when we say the soul loves God, right? If you remember back in chapter 3, we discussed how love is the you can think of love as the topography or the shape of the finite soul as it creates itself through Chochmah, Bin, and Das, through its intellect, right? As an object in the external world, as an objective reality that can interact externally with other objective realities, which is a very fancy way of saying that the soul's love means the thing that the soul fits together with, the thing that the soul by its very contours, by its very shape, is drawn towards, right? The place that it belongs, right? Think of a piece of a puzzle, right? The place that it fits, right, is defined by its love, right? Its fear, you would say, is the negative space, right? It's the space where it doesn't fit, right? It's the space that's not the puzzle piece, the space that's defined by what it's not, right? You could say in this convoluted and original metaphor. So the soul's love is the soul's fitting, is the soul's apt to fit together with Godness, is its love, right? To express that love is to actually fit together with God, is to actually cleave to God, is to fill the place in the puzzle, right? Is to be one with that reality, in dvekus, right? In profound cleaving, a profound clinging to God. And the Alter Rebbe says that if the soul wants to do that, the only way it can do it is through mitzvahs. And that's the one-line answer to the question. The one-line answer to the question of why have mitzvahs? Why have the soul do anything? Why does the soul need to do anything to connect to God? The answer is no. The soul needs to cleave to God. The soul has love. The culmination of that love is to cleave to God. And without mitzvahs, there is no cleaving to God. That's the answer to the question. Right? And therefore, the mitzvahs are an absolute necessity. And in fact, as we're going to see, they're not just a necessity in the sense of like a necessary evil. They are in fact more profound and loftier than the soul itself, right? Also with an asterisk, as we'll see. It's a complex issue. But they are loftier and more profound than the soul itself, even though they are more external. Right? Which sounds like a contradiction to the general principle of Tanya as we've been studying, which is that everything is defined according to pnimius, everything is defined according to the inner reality. But here is where that whole doctrine of the inner reality starts to get its qualifications. Well, the qualifications is not really fair because it fits with the idea, but you have to see that this idea can sometimes lead to counterintuitive conclusions, and that the innermost reality that we are looking for is not always culminated in itself, right? There's a certain lacking in being an inner being, and that lacking can only be fulfilled in externality, in departing from oneself, in doing something, particularly in this case, in doing mitzvahs, all of which we shall see as we go, God willing, through the chapter. Let's discuss outside before we get to the text. Why is it that only through mitzvahs can the soul cleave to God? Can the soul cleave to God? Right. This is like an argument with a lot of little steps. Right. So really, each step should be examined, and then we can put the steps together. This is what we were discussing literally at the very end of the last time we learned. So I'm just restarting the conversation, so to speak, as if in the middle. Right. That's the last line we read. The last line we read is. The It is impossible. It's about halfway down page Ches. It's impossible, and it's impossible to cleave to God in truth except through the fulfillment of the 248 positive commandments. It's the last line we read, if I recall correctly. So, good evening. Why is it that it's impossible for the soul to cleave to God except through the mitzvahs? And the truth is is that this is really a difficult question to answer. I'm going to do my best. It has to do with one of the reasons it's difficult is because it has to do with the definition of dveikus, of cleaving, which is a technical, defined Hasidic concept. In other words, this is not a poetic language. I don't know if Tanya has any poetic language. It's not really a very poetical work in the usual sense, in the sense that we may be in the sense of a beautiful metaphor or being used merely for aesthetic purposes. I don't know if such a thing really exists in Tanya. This is a technical term, dveikus. Dveikus is a technical term, cleaving to or clinging to God. And one of the central terms of Chassidus, one of the central terms of the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, is this concept of cleaving to God, dveikus. Davuk means attached. Dveikus means the act of attachment to God, cleaving to God, clinging to God. And the whole mystery of this chapter is untangled by dveikus, because what we're saying is the soul as it is without mitzvahs is lacking this thing. Even though we just back in chapter 2 says it's literally a piece of God and it couldn't get any closer to God. So how are both true? And the answer is it's not a contradiction. If you pay close attention, if you read carefully, you realize that it actually fits together perfectly. In fact, this is actually the perfect continuation of chapter 3, as I'm hoping to show tonight. Okay, that's what I hope our discussion will center around tonight. This fits into exactly how we've been explaining everything. That's my goal. Is I want to show you how this concept sort of ties into the previous chapters. Okay. Let's talk about the concept of ein aroich, which is actually not words that are not mentioned here in Tanya, but that are mentioned in the Chassidus Mevueres, in the main book that I used to prepare this chapter. The authors of that book, which include Rabbi Yoel of blessed memory and also Reb Melech of blessed memory, who was one of my mashpiyim in yeshiva, are among the team that authored that book. It's collective authorship, so no one can be held responsible for any particular line, right? That's the scheme. So you can't go up to them and say, "But you wrote." You can't. There's no proof. It's Chassidus Mevueres Tanya. It's called. Chassidus. It's not in English. The name or the book.
There's no English version.
Mm-hmm. Nope. Sorry. So. Where was I? They describe, in explaining why you need mitzvahs to cling to God, they describe it because they talk about God being ein aroich, be'ein aroich, compared to the creation, compared to the soul. Ein aroich is a very important concept. The Alter Rebbe himself will explain this concept using metaphors later in Tanya. But the authors of that book bring it right here, because really this is the concept to understand why you need mitzvahs, to have dveikus, to have clinging, okay? So first we're kind of doing it backwards, but first we'll explain why you can't cling to God except through the mitzvahs, and only then we're going to get to sort of trying to understand what we mean by clinging to God, really, right? By dveikus, by this form of attachment. Erech, there's a tractate of Talmud called Erchen, right, which you may have heard of. Does anyone know what the word Erech or Erchen means in Hebrew? L'chaim break. Erech means a value. Erchen means values or worths. Be'en aroich means not without value, but which may be a more literal translation. Be'en aroich means incommensurate. Be'en aroich means incommensurate is the correct English translation, and it's actually a rare English translation that literally says what's on the tin. That's literally what the word means. If you're commensurate, that means that you can both be measured by the same measuring stick, right? The Alter Rebbe's metaphor later in Tanya, I don't know if it's even a metaphor, the Alter Rebbe's explanation of the term later in Tanya is that 1 to 1,000,000 are be'erach one another. They're commensurate. Right, 1,000,000. There's a function that you understand that you can apply to 1 to yield 1,000,000. Right, you would say in mathematics. Right, whereas to infinity, 1 and 1,000,000 are equally be'en aroich. To infinity, 1 and 1,000,000 are equally incommensurate. In other words, you cannot measure them. Infinity is not really a number, as we used to discuss in grade school, right? Infinity is not really it's used like a number, but it's not a number. It's a concept, really, right? Because there is no infinity is not found on the list of numbers in the sense like the numbers you learned in school. I know it's more complicated than this, but that's the idea. The idea is incommensurate means that no matter how many you have of the smaller thing, you cannot get to the larger thing. So in other words, it's a different way of saying at an infinite remove, an uncrossable gap, right? A million, multiplying 1 by a million gets it no closer to infinity. Infinity and 1 are both equidistant from a million, pardon me, 1 and a million are both equidistant from infinity because infinity is not reached by just adding more finite numbers. You can't reach it that way. Yeah, this is what we mean by be'en areich. This is what we mean by incommensurate. Okay, be'en areich is the relationship inherently between a finite being and an infinite being. God is an infinite being, and in Chassidus even more so than usual, because Chassidus is even more radical about the infinitude of God than some other systems of thought or some other theologies. Right? God is truly infinite. And a finite being to an infinite being, a limited being to an unlimited being, is incommensurate. What this means, if two things are truly incommensurate to one another, it means that there is no stepwise process, or I would even use the word rational process, that you can use to reach one to the other. Right? In other words, no matter how great a limited being becomes, and they can become perhaps very great, right? It makes them no closer to reaching an infinite being. It's too different. It's off the spectrum, right? Even if you extend the spectrum without end, you don't get an infinite being. You just get an unendingly growing limited being, right? There's some kind of leap, right? It's like a different dimension. It's like if you have a two-dimensional plane like this table and you extend it infinitely, right? And I hold my hand 1 inch above the table, no amount of the infinite extension of this plane will ever reach my hand, even if my hand's only 1 inch away, right? That's what it means. That's what we mean by incommensurate. It's different dimensionality. It's not the extension and the adding to and the increasing in the quality and quantity of the one thing never somehow culminates in reaching the second thing. There's a gap. There's a leap that has to be made. Yes? The finite to the infinite. The limited to the unlimited. When two limited beings love each other, even though this itself requires explanation, even though this itself is not so simple, because in a sense, even two finite beings, even two human souls, are in a sense very distantly removed from one another, in a sense, in their private subjectivity, right? Which in a way is unbreachable, which in a way is not really, is a gap that in a way can never be crossed to a certain extent, right? In a different sense, and these senses, as I hope you'll see, these senses all fit into the broader picture here. This all makes sense in the broader scheme of things. Nevertheless, when a human being loves another human being, that can be a genuine love, right? Just by having feelings of love which are directed towards another human being as you perceive them, this forms a connection. This forms a real connection between two human beings. The reason for this, I am venturing, and the class is kind of built on what I'm venturing, so it is what it is, although I warned you before these classes started that it's the best I can do. The reason this is so, in my opinion, to my understanding, is that real aspects of the other person are understandable and lovable by the mind and the heart of the other person. If you have two finite and limited beings, right, then the other being, at least in theory, even if there's a very big gap between you, the gap in understanding can theoretically be breached, right? The love of the other person, even if the love is of a very superficial aspect, perhaps, right? Or maybe all aspects are superficial compared to relatively how deep every person goes. There's much speculation to be made here. Ultimately, what they are is within the realm of the lovable of the other person. It is within it can be grasped, right? There's no fundamental, there's no law of the universe. There's no law like a law of gravity, which says that there's no logical reason why one human being could not have the capacity to love another human being. The other human being is fundamentally lovable because the two of them are both finite, which means they both exist, at least in theory, in the same reality, right? They can both be given over to the same reality. You'll understand what I'm saying when we contrast with God in a moment, right? Let's use a metaphor before we get to God, right? If you have a person who's a true intellectual, right? Like let's say you have an Einstein, right? And Einstein is a true intellectual. They live in the world of ideas. Their sustenance and their joy is in the world of ideas, and their immortality and their lasting effect, their lasting impact, what they mean, what it means to be an Einstein has nothing to do with what type of shirt you wear. The two things are unrelated, right? But if you find a very boorish and simple person, and all they can appreciate about Einstein is his weird hair and his and whatever type of shirt he wears, right? That person and Einstein, in a smaller way, don't exist within the same universe, right? There is no way, there is no common ground where these two people can really meet, right? The two are totally unrelated. I'll make it stronger to bring out what I mean, right? You could do this with humans and animals as well, to a certain extent, right? A human being and an ant, right? The ant could be the most lovable and loving ant in the world. It could make all the right decisions. It could be a pro-human ant, right? But the real relationship, the real capacity for connection that there is extremely limited, right? Even from the human side. Even from the human side, by the way, because even from the human side, there's a very minor capacity to truly appreciate the life of an ant. I suppose if you studied them, etc., maybe more. This is true with humans and chimps as well, by the way, despite what some people might tell you. Humans, the advanced apes, are very, very different. We live in different worlds, right? It's similar. It's important to realize this because it sort of brings out what we say about Einstein and the boorish person who doesn't appreciate the intellect, right? Like we say, because some people nowadays have the tendency to say that, because apes fling excrement, right? And human beings also produce excrement, right? So it's like a reduction to the lowest common denominator, and clearly there's no difference between a human being and an ape fundamentally, right? Because we're all just doing the same thing. It's like this reductivist approach, right? Where an ape produces excrement, and a human being produces excrement, right? And but really, the truth is, if you stop being childish about it for 5 minutes, right? The truth is actually the opposite. The truth is that in the lowest extremities of what it means to be a human being, and think about this in terms of Einstein and the boar, right? In the lowest extremities of what it means to be a human being, in our most physical and lowly and undignified and unspiritual preoccupations or actions, right? Bodily needs and things like that, right? Even that, the human being has totally and utterly transformed in a way that's completely impossible for an ape to appreciate, right? And relate to at all. Go explain to the ape about the porcelain and the leaving the seat down, right? And all other such cultural behavior, and the difference between the Western facilities versus the facilities like I saw when I lived in Hong Kong, right? And the way that it works in Asia is very different, right? In other words, go explain this to a chimp. When the chimp understands about leaving the seat down, then we'll talk, right? In other words, it's and this is, if you think about Einstein and the boar, it's the same point, right? In other words, what we think that they have in common is really not even what they have in common. Because Einstein lives totally in a world of intellect, right? Even though superficially he wears a shirt like this guy wears a shirt, if you really dug into it, you would find out that the way Einstein wears a shirt is nothing like the way this guy wears a shirt. It's totally different, right? Because to Einstein, the shirt is merely a technicality that floats on a whole world of ideas and theoretical physics, and it's a totally external thing. Whereas this guy, he's much more down and low, and closer to the ground. And when he puts on a shirt, it has much more physical significance to him, and et cetera, et cetera. Right? So what my point in this discussion is to show you that even among the finite, the differences can be great, and it's more subtle than we sometimes assume. What seems to be a common denominator in a shared world, right, can often hash out to be two separate worlds. If this is true between two very different but limited and finite beings, right, imagine a finite being to an infinite being, a limited being to an unlimited being. Right? The human being, or in this case, not the human being, it's actually the wrong word to use, the godly soul, which has experienced some kind of distancing from God because it's only a piece of God, right? As we discussed in chapter 2, it's not God himself, God forbid. It's a piece of God, right? And we explained in chapter 2 how a piece has both things. A piece means on the one hand, you can't get any closer in a shared essence, but on the other hand, broken off, separated from, right? It's, as we say, it's elokus shanai sanivra. It's godliness that has become a creation, right? So in this act of becoming a creation, the godly soul becomes a limited being, to whatever extent, right? And the fact is, and this is where we start plugging back into earlier chapters, we've already explained that the godly soul becomes a limited being where especially, perhaps even in essence, I think even in essence, but even more so when it comes to its intellect and emotions, which we define as the immanentizing and the becoming limited, the becoming defined, the coming into definition and limitation of the godly soul in its intellect and in its emotions. Yes. So the godly soul becomes limited. And now this godly soul has love. It has a faculty of love. It has a puzzle that it wants to be part of. It has a form that is naturally drawn to godliness. The problem with the godly soul is, and this, in a way, this is very ironic. We don't have time to get into all of the poetry of this at the moment. In a later chapter, when we talk more about the animal soul versus the godly soul, we'll probably get back to this, although I won't remember by then. But we'll get back into this from that angle, right? In an ironic way, the godly soul wants something that it cannot have, that it literally cannot have, right? When two people love each other, even though they may be very distant, at least it's two limited beings. It's a limited being trying to love another limited being. The godly soul has become a limited being whose love is directed only towards an unlimited being, right? So in the metaphor of the puzzle piece fitting into the puzzle, right? The puzzle piece is a puzzle piece with a shape, like in a jigsaw puzzle, right? But the puzzle that it wants to fit into is wholeness. It wants to fit into something that has no hole and has no edges at all, right? It wants to fit into the place that it feels it belongs is the place of unlimitation. Its limited being is defined as that limited being which desires the unlimited. And this is a paradox. It cannot be. If it could attain the unlimited, it would cease to be what it is, right? That love could not exist because the love is the shape of the puzzle piece. That's what the love is, right? And if it attained what it wanted, there would be no puzzle piece, because if you remove the edges of the puzzle piece, there's nothing left, right? This is why later in Tanya, when we talk about Mesiras Nefesh, which is many chapters from now, the Jewish self-sacrifice in one of the great central chapters of the Tanya, either 18 or 19 or both, I can't remember. We talk about how all the godly soul wants is to no longer exist, right? Is that not this very notion, right? Its very tendency, and again, it's very ironic because the reason I said it was ironic before is the same one now, because really, in a way, this is all true of the animal soul, but in the opposite way. This will be a longer discussion we could have at a different time. The animal soul also wants to not exist, but in a very different way than the godly, whatever. This is a discussion for a different time. The godly soul wants nothing more than to no longer exist, because its very existence, right, is defined by limitation, as it has come into limitation anyway, right? And what it wants is God. Now, what is the solution to this issue? There is only one possible solution to this issue. Why there is only one possible solution, we'll get into more in a moment. But the possible solution to this issue is that God has to help. The solution is God has to help. In other words, there is no resolution of this paradox that is possible from within the limitation of the godly soul. The godly soul loves something that it cannot possess. It desires to fit into something, the fitting into of which would make it no longer be, right? So how can the soul actually love God? How can it actually express that love, right? Because if it's expressible, then it's expressible of a finite being, and so the thing that is expressed and the thing that is loved is not God, right? But if it is of God, then it cannot be a finite expression of love. It cannot be the love of the godly soul, the love which is defined as a created being. And therefore, you're stuck. You can't get there. The soul as a finite creation cannot love God. A limited creation cannot love God. The only solution is God has to help from his end unilaterally. And that is what the mitzvahs are. The commandments of God, right, are God enclothes himself within something that is appreciable and expressible by the limited godly soul. And by expressing those things as a meeting place, the soul is able to grasp God, not by any rational principle, because we just explained that rationally, this doesn't really work. There is no explanation for how this is possible, but by the will of God. Because God chooses the mitzvahs, and what we mean by the choosing of and desiring of his commandments, when we say God wants you to wrap physical tefillin, we don't have an opportunity in this class at this point, it would be a distraction, to even begin to go into how deep this goes in Chassidus, the explanation of what we mean that God chooses and wants the mitzvahs, which is the most profound desire of God, perhaps. The most profound desire of God is that you should actually take a leather box and put it on your arm. More profound than any other desire, perhaps. But suffice it to say, that profundity, the profundity of that desire, is we are describing how God puts himself into the mitzvahs. So the answer is that God puts himself into something that a limited being can express, right? Namely the mitzvahs. And so the soul, which feels a profound desire for closeness with God, it wants to fit into that puzzle, the only means that it can express and culminate and bring to fruition that desire to be close to God, to cleave to God, is through the mitzvahs. It's through the thing that God has given it that gives it the means to do the impossible, which is attachment to the infinite. This is why we often say in Chassidus that mitzvahs come from the term tzavsa v'chibur. Mitzvahs come from attachment. Mitzvahs are normally translated as commandment, and that is the literal translation and the Hasidic translation. But what is a commandment, right? A commandment is a form of attachment, right? Which is very different than the English connotation of the term commandment. English connotation of the term commandment implies distance, perhaps, right? And there is an aspect of that as well in Chassidus, maybe. But we usually say that mitzvahs mean attachment. Mitzvahs means God gives himself over and places himself within, in a sense that we will discuss much more in this chapter, the metaphor for that. The metaphor of this is the soul is the body to the soul, right? That it's like the king's limbs or organs, right? That just as the body is vivified by and a vessel for the vitality of the soul, each organ and each limb according to its function, right? So too, each of the commandments is a vessel for and is a conveyance for the infinite light of God, the infinite presence of God. This is in the commandments. Therefore, the soul, by attaching itself to commandments, by expressing commandments, right? And remember, last class we said that the mitzvahs are the soul's natural form of self-expression, right? It's a natural expression of love. And these two things overlap. The godly soul's natural desire of self-expression and of love, right, is in those things which allow it to cleave to God, which allow it to have dveikus and cling to godliness. Okay, are there any questions so far?
This goes in line with the natural manifestation of the godly soul in the physical world is through the commandments themselves.
Yeah.
Is that
the manifestation of the godly soul. Say again?
Previously, we spoke of you spoke about the way the godly soul expresses.
Yes,
yes, in the physical world
exactly.
Is through commandments.
Correct. Yes,
building on that.
It's exactly what we're saying. The soul's what moves the soul to express itself externally at all? The answer is love and fear of God. And how does that love and fear of God find expression? Only in the mitzvahs. It could find expression only in Torah and mitzvahs, only in the divine commandments. There is
positive commandments, those attachment, the negative commandments, are those also ways of the soul attaching?
Yes, we'll get to that more next week, Adonian. Alter Rebbe talks about that later in the chapter. The difference between the positive and negative commandments. So, in summary, the soul is a piece of God. That piece of God is a creation. It's Elokus Shanais Nivra. It becomes a creation with the limits of a creation, especially as we've described how the soul comes into finitude as a finite and limited creation in its intellect and emotions.
Does it still exist as a thought in the mind of God, or is it actually like a finite created through speech?
We spoke about in chapter 2 how the thought in the mind of God is the soul as it is in its root, but then it's brought down through all of the worlds to come down into the lowly world that we occupy, right? So it's of the mind of God, as we explained back in chapter 2, and we could review. Maybe helpful to review some classes from chapter 2. The what the soul is remains of the mind of God, but it becomes distanced through the process of becoming a creation from that reality, and that's true even of the souls of the great tzaddikim, even they, which undergo a lot less. They go through a lot less centrifuging through the worlds. Even they become creations, become limited. So to summarize, the soul is a piece of God that becomes a creation, but it doesn't cleave to God. Cleaving needs Torah and mitzvahs, right? And there is no true love without this cleaving to God. The love can only be culminated. There is no love that reaches its expression, right? That reaches its object. Without cleaving to God, the love can only be a longing. It cannot actually find culmination, right? And mitzvahs themselves, in turn, and cleaving to God is only through mitzvahs, as we said, and the mitzvahs, in turn, only find their true vitality and their There, as we said, kiyum amiti, the persistence of the mitzvahs and consistency of the mitzvahs is only possible when they are vivified by this love and this desire to cleave to God. So in other words, mitzvahs are most real when they are motivated by the love of the godly soul, right? And the love of the godly soul is most real and most culminated in mitzvahs. Yeah. Let's read a little bit, God willing. We are on the Efshar, the last words of the line, about halfway down the page on page Ches. In the English, it's the very beginning, at the top of the second column in the English on page 14. One cannot truly cleave to him. Yeah, the Efshar. The Efshar, I would say, is stronger than cannot. I mean, Efshar means it's impossible. L'davka boy, to cleave to God. Be'emes, in truth. Kiyim, says the Holy Tanya, says in the holy words of the Alter Rebbe, Kiyim b'kiyum ramach pekudin, except through the fulfillment of the 248 positive commandments. It's impossible to cleave to him in truth except through the fulfillment of the 248 commandments. It's interesting, I'm just looking in here. They don't say in truth in their English translation. A rare, in my opinion, misstep, and perhaps we could say in the English translation, top page 14, because there is the word in truth here that the Alter Rebbe says, and it's not in the English translation. In truth, be'emes. In other words, there is a cleaving which is not true, that is possible without the mitzvahs, it sounds like, right? But in truth, you can't cleave in truth except through the 248 positive commandments. The difference being that there is some kind of cleaving to God, apparently that's possible merely through loving God, because you could have apparently the soul can have some kind of superficial connection with God in some way, merely by wanting to attach itself to him. But the true form of that connection is in the mitzvahs, is in fulfilling the commandments. It's very important to take a moment here and make an important distinction. That's important when you learn Chassidus as a modern person, as a person that comes from a contemporary world. The contemporary world has totally lost any feeling and any sense for, we are not educated for, the notion of a true spiritual connection in the sense of cleaving that we are discussing here. I'll tell you what I mean by that. What I mean by that is, let's say a person loves a certain artist, let's say, just for a random example. Let's say a person loves Van Gogh, right? A person loves Van Gogh paintings. They go around the world looking at Van Gogh paintings. They love Van Gogh, okay? Does the person have a true connection with Van Gogh himself? Let's say, for purposes of argument, Van Gogh is alive. Before we don't overcomplicate things, right? Let's say I would use a living artist, but I don't know any. So let's say for argument's sake, Van Gogh is alive, right? An author, person loves Harry Potter, right? So let's bring things down to our level here in this class, right? J.K., things that I can appreciate. The person likes J.K. Rowling, right? They love that work of art for whatever it's worth, right? That we appreciate. Does the person have any actual connection with that individual or not? The modern way of saying it, really all modern philosophy, and it doesn't stay in philosophy, because what comes from philosophy, especially the influential early modern philosophies, has filtered down through the whole culture, and especially through science and other ways of thinking about things. The modern way of saying things is that my appreciation of Van Gogh is really an appreciation of my idea of Van Gogh. There's no actual connection with Van Gogh. In other words, when I think a thought in general, I'm only ever thinking what I really think is my idea of the thought. In fact, the very term idea, as it's used in modern parlance, was invented by and introduced to the English lexicon by, prize for the winner, I don't know what prize I have. The very word idea in the modern usage, how we use the word idea, was not a common English word before, I don't know, 500 years ago. Introduced, maybe less, 400, 300. My history is not as good as my random trivia facts. But it was introduced to the lexicon of English by a person you may have heard of. Not Shakespeare.
This is before Ben Franklin.
Before Ben Franklin.
It's not Shakespeare.
It's not Shakespeare. It was introduced by a philosopher named John Locke. John Locke introduced the notion of the idea to English, right? I was saying that completely innocently. The idea that what we think is actually the idea rather than the thing that we are thinking, right? Rather, instead of J.K. Rowling and Van Gogh, you can make it even simpler, right? The Pythagorean theorem. I like math because it's very stark and simple, right? Or 2 + 2 = 4 even, right? When a person knows 2 + 2 = 4, the concept, right? Concept like an idea. When a person knows 2 + 2 = 4, do they know 2 + 2 = 4? Or are they thinking of the idea? Do they know their idea that 2 + 2 = 4? While this may seem a subtle difference, it is not a subtle difference at all. It is actually a cataclysmic, world-changing difference. That two things could not be more different. Believe it or not, right? Do I know the thing itself, or do I know my idea of the thing? All modern philosophies in general would say I know the idea of the thing, generally speaking, right? Why is this relevant to the Tanya? This is relevant to the Tanya because in Tanya, when we talk about dveikus, when we talk about attachment to God, and I cannot tell you how long between the first time I learned Tanya and the first time I could put what I'm going to tell you now into language, right? How long that gap was, right? It was a long time because you bring your misconceptions, and the misconceptions that you bring are sometimes so ingrained that you can't even name the misconceptions that you possess, but you possess them nevertheless, and they color your entire understanding, right? They color your understanding at a level where they're totally invisible, right? You cannot see their misconceptions that color things. So one of the common misconceptions you could bring to the study of Chassidus and the studying of really, maybe even Torah in general, you could argue. But one of the misconceptions you could bring to the study of Chassidus is the idea that when we say cleaving to God, right, what we really mean is some kind of purely internal process to the soul, right? In other words, if you have a God-fearing person and a God-attaching person, you are fundamentally describing an orientation of the personality or an orientation of the soul. When I say orientation, the idea I want you to have is like of something turning in place, right? Like a weather vane, right? The weather vane could point to the world, or it could point towards God, right? And that is the misconception. The misconception that when we talk about attachment to God, we're talking about the direction the person is facing, right? The Alter Rebbe could not be more literal when the Alter Rebbe says cleaving to God. It cannot be more literal. We mean literally that the godly soul literally attaches to God. Literally is not the same as physically, but literally attaches to God in the simple understanding. In other words, because if you don't understand, and why am I bringing this all up tonight? Because if you don't understand this, you don't even understand the problem here. How can you understand the solution if you don't understand the problem, right? The problem is that you have a finite being that wants to attach to God, right? If you believe that attachment to God means a transformation in place, you don't see the problem, right? What do you mean? I can relate to God. I relate to God as an idea. I relate to God as a concept. Most of what we call relating to God and discussing God, maybe even in this class, is something that the animal soul is doing, by the way. We haven't even got to this is beyond even that. This is way beyond what we're even talking about, right? Most of what we call relating to God is an animal soul issue, right? And has nothing to do with this, right? This is something else. This is the godly soul by its absolute nature wants nothing other than God, right? Nothing other than God. If you feel as an individual you like one thing other than God, that's the animal soul, not the godly soul, right? The godly soul wants only God. But even the godly soul, even the literal piece of God, which we may not even in our conscious experience have any idea what that looks like or what that means, right? To be a piece of God. Even that thing is created and becomes limited. And in its limitation, it cannot attach to God because God is too big. Not in the physical sense, but so literally that the physical metaphor is apt, right? In other words, don't make the mistake that we're talking about physically, but the point is that it's a real issue. It's a real issue. That's what you have to try and see here, right? The soul needs to attach to God, but you attach to things that are too big for you to understand all the time, right? You may have emotional feelings about, I don't know, the solar system, right? And the solar system is too big for me to understand, really, right? But I have feelings about it because I have feelings about what I appreciate about the solar system, right? Some factoid or some emotional occurrence when I went to the planetarium when I was 5, whatever it is, right? This is not like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the godly soul's inability to speculate about God at a distance. The godly soul is oriented towards God always, right? It has no other orientation, which means that, of course, it has feelings about God from a distance, right? In fact, it has no other feelings. That's its very nature, right? What we're talking about when we say dveikus is that the soul doesn't want to love God from a distance. It wants to actually attach to God in the most literal and profound sense. It wants God and it to be one puzzle. It wants to complete the puzzle that is the God puzzle in the most literal sense, right? And then you see the problem because God is not a puzzle missing a piece. God is, as we would say in Hebrew, he's chalak, he's smooth. There's no edges. There's nowhere for anything to fit in. He's truly infinite. And if he's truly infinite, then how can you attach to it, right? You attach to something by the edges. You attach to something by the shape if you're a limited being, right? You attach to it in a relative way. God doesn't have relative ways, right? God is an absolute. There's all different English words you could use to describe this discrepancy, right? But the limited being cannot attach to the unlimited being. And if you think it's just about emotional attachment, like your emotional support hamster, right? You miss the point entirely, right? God is not the godly soul's emotional support hamster, right? The godly soul wants to cling to God, right? The same way a body might cling to another body, but not in the physical sense. And in fact, this is actually a description of the soul's relationship with God that's found in the Torah, right? Of a body clinging to another body. The Rebbe has a whole sikha about the month of Teves, which is the cold month, the month when a body takes pleasure from another body, which is literally describing the physical warmth of two bodies. And the Rebbe has a sikha where he explains this as the most profound relationship of the soul with God. When we talk about the godly soul in Chassidus, we're talking about a real connection of two spiritual things that actually connect, not have the idea of connecting. And the more the sooner we start to focus on purging ourselves of this notion that all spiritual connections are from a distance and are really spiritual connections only with yourself, right, the better. Although that may be true of the animal soul. Remains to be seen. We'll discuss that in later chapters. The animal soul, according to Chassidus, it seems, to my best knowledge, works more in the modern sense, which is immediately whatever, and that's a whole other discussion as well. But the animal soul, certainly in relation to God anyway, right, cannot achieve this true unity. This true unity is the purview of the godly soul. The godly soul is able to have this unity, and the truth is that this problem is really only a problem of the godly soul anyway. So as usual, the problem of the godly soul has the unique problem of the godly soul has a unique godly soul solution, right? Whereas the animal soul's relationship with God is not going to be in this cleaving, in this way of cleaving, in the same fashion. We'll get to the animal soul, as I always say when we get to it. I just thought that it's important to clarify this because this is it sounds like such a small thing. It's not a small thing at all. This can color your whole understanding of Chassidus. It prevents you from even hearing the words the Alter Rebbe is saying. The Alter Rebbe says, cleave to God, and you hear some kind of feeling, right? It's not a feeling. Cleaving to another person, if you cling to another person, that is not a feeling. That is a description of a state of affairs, right? Objectively so, right? So too cleaving to God. The soul cleaving to God is a description of an objective state of affairs, not a subjective one. Okay? That rant is over anyway. And so really, you could summarize what we've discussed so far tonight is that chapter 4 is really here to reconcile chapter 2 and chapter 3. Chapter 2 says the godly soul is infinite and infinitely close to God. Chapter 3 says the godly soul becomes limited, separated, right? Separated from God. It no longer cleaves to God. It's a finite defined being with finite defined desires, right? And chapter 4 comes and explains how these two are not in contradiction, because with the power of mitzvahs, right, with the power of Torah and mitzvahs, the limited godly soul can manifest and can express what it really is, which is literally a piece of God. And so through the mitzvahs and through Torah, you could say the limited soul is returned to its true nature, to return to what it truly is, which I believe, in other words, is something that it says in Chassidus many times. Yeah. Let's read just a little further, a couple more minutes. Oh, by the way, maybe we won't get a chance to read further because I have by the way. By the way, this explains why the Alter Rebbe here says the 248 rather than the 613, right? We mentioned positive and negative mitzvahs, right? We'll talk more about the negative mitzvahs next week because the Alter Rebbe is going to go and talk about fear of God. So far we've spoken mostly about love of God in this chapter, and we'll talk about the 365 negative commandments. But the 248 positive, he says it cannot... it's impossible to cleave to God in truth except through the fulfillment of the 248 positive commandments. Why? Right? He's going to say because the 248 commandments are love of God, and the 365 negative commandments manifest fear of God, right? But the truth is, if you think about it, right, that both of them really cover both, if you really think about it. There's no reason why if you really love someone, you'll make sure not to violate their bands, right? And if you really fear someone, you'll make sure to fulfill their positive commandments. In other words, it seems like it's both for both. It's not clear immediately why it should divide this way, why love should be specifically associated with the positive commandments and fear with the negative ones, right? But in light of this broader discussion, you can actually understand the reason why. Because when we say cleaving to God, right, we are talking not about, and here's where you see that my whole rant actually helps you understand the actual text of Tanya, right? It wasn't just a rant for rant's sake, although that's also fun. Cleaving to God does not mean a general loving orientation of the soul. The 248 ways to cleave to God are describing specific forms, right? For lack of a better term, specific forms that cleaving can take, and the only forms that cleaving to God can affirmatively take. right? You understand the difference? So in other words, the Alter Rebbe says, it's impossible to cleave to God in truth, except through fulfilling the 248 positive commandments. Why not the 365 negative commandments? Why not fear of God, right? And the answer is that no, that fear of God can be a motivation, right, to keep the 248 positive commandments. But what are you actually doing in fulfilling the 248 commandments? You're actually cleaving to God, right? Which is why you can only cleave to God through the 248 positive commandments, right? The negative commandments, which are not murdering someone, right, may be part of the broader, what we broadly mean by a relationship with God, right, and their sphere of God, etc., as we're going to get to. But in terms of the act of cleaving to God, which, as we've just finished saying, is an objective act, it's something that you actually do. It's not a feeling, right? That is why there's only 248 ways to do it, right? And that's why it's only through the 248 positive mitzvahs. The reason we don't say through all 613 mitzvahs is because 365 things are not objective ways to cleave to God. There's something else. They're part of the broader relationship with God. Here we're saying that since cleaving is actually an objective act and not just a description of an emotional relationship with God, right? So there's a list of those acts. There's 248 of them. There's specific lists, right? There's 248 acts that are actual acts of cleaving to God. Now, this explanation is an explanation that came from that sefer from Chassidus Mu'eres, and this explanation has, I wouldn't say having its limits would be a bit pompous to say. This explanation, I have questions on this explanation, because as I mentioned the last time we learned, some of the positive mitzvahs involve not doing things, right? And some of the negative mitzvahs involve doing things. So how that sort of breaks out, I don't know. It's above my pay grade, so I'm just letting you know that I have questions on this explanation. But that's the explanation from that book, and it fits with our class that we've been saying, right? That the 248 positive commandments are the list of acts of cleaving to God, which are objective. The soul cleaving to God is an objective reality, and that objective reality is manifest only in the 248 mitzvahs. We will, God willing, continue next week.